Our next talk is called Don't Go Breaking My Heart. It's about safeguarding. And our speaker is Giles Armstrong. Giles is a PEM consultant who comes from a paediatric background. He's working in London at the moment.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for hanging around to hear me talk. It's always fun during the afternoon of the last day of a conference. So I'm delighted that Tessa gave me that slot. Thank you, Tessa. Speaking of which, can I have a timer, please? Excellent. So, when Tessa asked me to talk for this conference, DFTB is a new type of conference for me to present at, and slightly outside my comfort zone, if I'm honest. I'd much rather be standing up here and talking about something far more concrete and absolute. I am by nature a logical, concrete, absolute thinker. But in the spirit of pushing things outside of my comfort zone, I'm going to take a very different tack about talking about safeguarding. So if you wanted to hear about the latest evidence around the stats for non-accidental injury, I'm afraid this is the wrong talk. What this talk is about curiosity. So very much in the way that Mary spoke yesterday morning about having a word in our minds for the conference, this has been my word. And I promise this is the only bit of text in the entire talk. I did manage to squeeze it past the conference organizers, who are very much more picture-friendly. But I thought it's really useful to understand where curiosity comes from linguistically. And the thing that I found really fascinating is it comes from the same root that we get the word care from, and indeed the same word we get the word cure from. So it's only by being curious that we can both care and cure for our patients, and particularly when it comes to safeguarding. I'd also like to say that having recently acquired this little darling called Lumi, I am very well aware that curiosity is definitely not just a feature of humans. It is definitely there in animals as well, and she's been teething this week, so I've got some nice self-harm marks on my wrist, which are actually her screaming. Anyway, so sometimes curiosity gets a bad rap, and it's certainly true that it isn't always helpful. When I was 5, I learned what happens when you're curious and you stick your finger in the light socket when the power is still on because your mum's been changing the bulb and forgot to pull it out. It's exciting, you get thrown across the room. And about a year later, I learned what happens if you run through a field of nettles in shorts. It's not a good idea. And of course, we all know what curiosity did to the cat. So there's a bit of ambivalence around the concept of curiosity as being a positive force, but I'm going to try and convince you over the course of 3 scenarios that actually curiosity can be the point where you get to save somebody's life and actually make a difference to what happens to them. So, the first case is one dark night. It's an ED, it's an inner city ED, and a patient rocks up at 10:30, 11:15. He's a 13-year-old boy, and he's had a bike accident. And he's come in because he's got a cut on the front of his leg. It's actually a fairly nasty pretibial laceration. So this is where you get to join in. So if everyone can pull out their Pool Everywhere apps or website, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to get logged in. So that's DFTB19 784. I believe you can even join in at home. So, the question is, back, when we're ready. The question is, what are you curious about? So this isn't a pool where you get to choose an option, you get to tell me. It's a free text game. So just write what's curious for you in that story. Now, obviously, I've given you a bit of a clue. There is clearly something to be curious about. If it was a straightforward case, I wouldn't be presenting it in a talk about curiosity. Right, are we ready to move to the next slide? Excellent, no responses received yet. So hopefully, in a moment, the case was a 13-year-old lad who's presented to your ED at about 10:30, 11:15 at night, having fallen off his bike with a pretibial laceration. Ooh, biking at night, good. What was he doing at 10:30 p.m.? Yeah, it was a school night as well. It was a Thursday evening. Why is he out riding his bike at 10 p.m.? Yeah. Any other thoughts? Anybody else? 13-year-old riding his bike at that time of night, yeah. So everyone's getting one theme, which is great. The question I asked is, where was his mum? Because he came by himself. He didn't present with a parent, he presented by himself. Now, I can get that he might have been out riding his bike late at night, but I would have thought he would have probably come in and said, you know, Mum, I've hurt my leg. All right, let's go to the emergency department. So all good. I'm going to move on to the next slide, he says, gesticulating seamlessly. I knew this would be a tech failure, but never mind. So, what's his QTC? Yes, very good. So, we were very curious. We weren't actually curious when he came in, but I was curious when I came in the next day. And we caused some investigations to be made. And what we discovered was that actually this young man was the youngest of 3 siblings, and his 2 elder siblings were both over 18, and were both currently residing at Her Majesty's pleasure in a prison for quite significant amounts of drug dealing, and in fact were major kingpins in the local drug economy. And it then doesn't take too much difficulty working out why a 13-year-old boy was cycling by himself at 10:30 at night around the streets of London and didn't bring his mum with him when he came to hospital. Because of that chain of events, we were actually able to escalate to social care. I'm abbreviating the story, but he did eventually get placed with a foster family. Now, the reality is he's come up from a situation where he's got some challenging life events, and I don't know what's going to happen to him, but I do know that if we hadn't been curious about why he came in with those injuries at that time of night by himself, he wouldn't have got to the place where he's now living with a family who are trying to show him there's a different way to get on in the world that doesn't involve cycling around delivering drugs at 10:30 at night. Okay, different track. So this is working day, middle of the afternoon, and you're in your ED, and a 14-year-old young lady books in by herself. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And she's quite smartly dressed, which for our part of London is slightly unusual. Not in the sense that people don't look their best, but they don't tend to have huge amounts of funds. And I get drawn aside by one of our very astute nurses, and they point out that that's a real designer handbag that she's carrying. I wouldn't have done. So, time for polling again. So the question this time is, what's curious about this case? What is not straightforward? What makes you sit up and pay attention? And hopefully the poll should be active. Yep, and we can move on to the responses once they start coming through. Again, yeah, she came in by herself. Now, that's not as uncommon. Ooh, is she a sex worker? Now, there's an interesting phrase. We'll come back to that one. Where are her parents? Yes, she again come in by herself. She'd attended without any adult with her. It was a school day. Again, I reference the fact that 14-year-olds should be in school in this country and in Australia. And why wasn't she in school? CSE is coming up. I'm not sure, I have to be honest, whether CSE is used in the same way in Australia. Can any of my Australian colleagues tell me if they know what CSE stands for? No, okay. So CSE, why is she in RED? Well, alone, gifts and grooming. I like that. Where's the money from? Expensive bag and no nanny. Yeah, we don't really get nannies in RED, but I have worked other places where we do get them. Yep, she's alone. Okay, so we're going to move on because these are very good questions, and this is the point. So, prostitution. We were actually concerned that this young girl was a victim of CSE. CSE is a term we use in British safeguarding. It refers to child sexual exploitation. And what it means is that somebody is deliberately targeting you to be groomed to engage in group sex. There were a couple of words that propped up: child prostitution, sex worker. So there's a very good quote for somebody, which is, there is no such thing as a child prostitute, there is only a victim of child abuse. And that's exactly what these young people are. The difficulty is that when you talk to them in the early stages of this very calculating, very manipulative behavior, they regard their abusers as being their emotional touchstone. They actually want to be with these people. They are giving them gifts. They are giving them designer handbags. And they are actually taking care of them. And they will specifically target vulnerable young people who have no other center in their lives. So children who've been removed from home already, children who are victims of physical abuse on the part of their carers. These are the people they reach for. And because of the fact that this young lady pitched up in RAD with this very expensive designer handbag, we rang social services, and they went, actually, we've been really concerned this young girl is at risk of CSE. She's been going missing from school. She's been found by the police a couple of times, unaccompanied at night. And this was the next piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And it gave her, again, an option for a different future to the one that she was going down. Again, I can't give you any quick fixes. I can't tell you that this definitely saved her life, but I can tell you it gave her an opportunity that she wasn't going to have if we hadn't picked up on the fact that this was something happening. Okay. So last one. So this is a busy weekend in your emergency department, and a 15-year-old young boy books in with a very tragic story. And he tells you that his mum, who was a single mum, had died about 18 months ago. And since then, he'd actually been living on the streets. And he's been living homeless, moving from place to place. And the reason he's attended is because he's actually been beaten up by a gang recently. So within the last 24 hours, he's been assaulted. And he's come in because he's a victim of an assault, but he gives this explanation for how he came to be assaulted in the first place. And he does have some minor abrasions and scrapes. So, over to you again. So are we ready to go live? Excellent. When did he last eat? Yep. Was he on drugs? Yep. Any relatives in the picture? Who were his attackers? It's a good question. Vulnerable? Is there any other family around? Well, that was a very good question. Why did he get assaulted? How did no one realize this before? And why is he presenting now? Well, the story for him presenting now is because he'd just been assaulted. Is he in a gang? Yeah, that's a good question. Do you have a contact number for next of kin? Sexual abuse. That was one that actually I was quite concerned about when I first heard the story. I wondered whether he'd been... I know what happens to young people who live on the streets, and one of the things they often do is they do end up having to sell themselves. Okay, we're going to move on from this one. So we have some amazing people part of our safeguarding team, and one of our child protection advisors was actually on call. I heard about this about 2 days later, and she heard the story, and she was really curious. And what she was most curious about was that he was 15. And actually what that means is that from his story, he would gone missing when he was 13 and a half-ish. And thankfully, it is actually quite difficult to drop out of society at the age of 13 and a half without anybody paying any attention. You are meant to be in universal education. There will be people who know you. There will be people who will miss you. And so she went on to Facebook, which is apparently an invaluable tool in child protection, and she went to see if there was any evidence that this young man had been reported missing by anyone. And in fact, he had. He'd been reported missing 48 hours ago by his mother and father, both of whom were alive and well, and living in the neighbouring area to us. He'd travelled about 5 miles to get to us. And his whole story was made up. Now, obviously, he wasn't coming from a nice, normal family, because nice, normal people do not abrogate themselves from their family and pitch up an ED and tell you that their mother died 18 months ago. But it was fascinating that if it wasn't for the curiosity of that person, we would have put him into a system which would probably have resulted in him ending up in care very quickly. He's an unaccompanied 15-year-old who tells you he's been living on the streets. We would have done everything we could to get him to a place of safety. Actually, what needed to happen was to find out why he was absconding from his family and what was going on. So again, I can't tell you that I know that there's a happy ending, but I can tell you that it wasn't that person being curious, we would have gone down a different path. So why aren't we more curious? Because that's my question. I spend a lot of time as the safeguarding lead going, but did nobody ask about this? So sometimes people suggest it's because people are bored when I bang on about safeguarding, or that they're just exhausted and they can't take it anymore. Or sometimes that we get tunnel vision. ED in particular, we get very task-focused. We concentrate on getting the patient out of our department and doing the task, and so perhaps we don't think about the wider things. But I'm actually going to give one final poll and get you to tell me why you think people aren't more curious, particularly in the ED environment. So I think most people in the room have familiarity with ED. So why is it that people aren't curious? Time, the 4-hour rule. time. There's a theme coming through here, isn't there? Scared about the answer. That's a really good one, and I do like that, and I think that is something that sometimes we use some of our other answers to actually cover up for the fact that it can be scary asking difficult questions. Somebody else's problem? Yeah. Mine, frequently. I am the name doctor for safeguarding. You'd be amazed what I get thrown at me. Performance measured by number seen. Okay, we're going to move on. So, I'm delighted to say that I thought the commonest answer you would give was that we were too busy. It's almost like I'm psychic. But I think that is something that, particularly in the UK with our 4-hour rule, we are very aware of the fact that we have a limited amount of time to address these concerns, and there is this focus on just fixing the problem, getting it out of the department, getting them out of the, what was it, cesspool of disease, I think was the phrase. Yes, thank you. I'm never going to be looking at my department the same way. Okay, so the question for this talk, because I do want to take you home with something, is can you instill curiosity? So although I can't give you the scientific evidence behind curiosity and the importance of it, I can tell you that the NSPCC, which is a UK charity specialising in the care of children who are victims of cruelty, reviews all the serious case reviews where cases have gone wrong, and one of their common themes is a lack of professional curiosity. Just go onto their website, type in NSPCC serious case reviews, and see how many times the word curiosity pops up. So it is something we need to look about. So, can we instill curiosity? Well, I would argue that anyone who's been online in the last 5 years must be aware of the fact there's an entire industry formed in instilling curiosity and getting people to follow the links and find out what Damien Rowland does actually look like now. Okay? So I think curiosity can be catching. And I think the way curiosity is catching is a combination of things. I think humans like stories, and I think that's one of the themes of this conference generally, is that stories are a way to get people invested in change. You need the knowledge to back up the stories. Stories by themselves don't get you anywhere. But stories plus knowledge and working as a team really can make a difference in terms of engaging the people who are doing the frontline work. And remember, in my stories, it was a doctor who picked up the first one, a nurse who picked up the second one, a safeguarding advisor who picked the third one. It is not just down to one person, it's a teamwork. We can instill this sense of curiosity, and I hope that some of you might go back to your departments and have a little think about what the support is for people in your department who want to be curious about these cases. What are their accesses to support? What are the resources you can put them in the direction of? And how can you support people in being curious with the pressure of time? So, that is me. And the question is anyone still curious? Has anyone got any questions? Oh, and I came in under time.
Perfect timing, Giles.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Okay, any questions from the floor? And I'm just looking at Jane, waiting to see if anything's coming on Twitter yet. Do you want to speak up and I'll repeat the question for you? Okay, fantastic question. Just for the recording, it's about, is it an invasion of privacy for us to use the information we've gathered about someone to look at their information on social media?
So I think if you're saying that this person comes in and says that they are James Smith who lives at 14 Stone Street, and you go immediately onto social media to see what you can find out, and I think there is an argument for that. For clarity, that wasn't the circumstances in this case. What happened in this case is that the safeguarding advisor just looked for missing children. So it wasn't that she was targeting that individual. He'd actually given us slightly false details, as you might imagine, in the circumstances. He didn't come in and give us his real name. And so she just looked for missing teenagers, and she looked in London and surrounding regions. And there is quite a lot on Facebook. We actually get quite a lot of emails about missing teenagers as well. So that's how she found him. So I don't think there's any problem with that. I don't think that breaches any sort of ethical boundary. You can argue that he had something that he was concerned about that he'd left home for, and that's not an invalid concern. But he was still 15. he had placed himself in a very risky situation. So from a safeguarding perspective, we talk about acting in the child's best interest, and I don't think he was acting in his best interest by fronting up to a random ED and telling them he'd been living homelessly for 18 months because his mum had died and he didn't have any other family. So at that point, it's a fairly easy one for us to contact social care and say, look, guys, this is what's going on. I mean, in fact, social care and police had been informed as soon as he pitched it in the department, so it was actually going back and saying, oh, we think we have some information for you, which was very useful.
Okay, any other questions from the floor? And anything from Twitter, Jane?
Just wanting to know that when you're approaching the discussions, do you have a certain way that you approach it in the ED that would be different outside of the ED?
So one of the best tricks I learned from a friend who's a child psychiatrist about when you want to ask a nosy question. And she's amazing, and she just goes up and goes, you know, I'm a really nosy person. Can I just ask? And she does it in a really open and transparent but very friendly fashion. And it's amazing how often people go, oh, all right then, yeah, and tell you things. I think sometimes we are too cautious about upsetting people, and so we ask it in roundabout fashions. And actually, in general, if you look at the evidence around how young people prefer to be spoken to in the emergency department setting, one of the things they value is transparency and honesty. And I think we sometimes worry a bit too much, and we ask in very tangential ways, and has anybody done anything that you don't like? And it's a bit too nebulous, isn't it? Yeah, the teacher gave me an extra homework I didn't like that at all. Okay. As opposed to, I'm really curious, that's a really nice bag you've got. How on earth did you get that? I know it's really nosy of me, but God, yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? And actually, it's very difficult to back away from that as an answer. As a human, you want to give an answer, particularly if you sell it as this is a positive. You know, this is nice for you. People like to talk about things that are nice for them. And if she clammed up immediately and said, "Oh," then actually that in itself is worrying. If she said, "Oh well, my mum works at this place, and we got a discount, and I saved up, and it was my Christmas and birthday," well, okay, it's a different story. But I think being transparent and honest in your questioning and being clear that you're asking a nosy question, but doing so in a charming and smiling manner, allows you to get away with an amazing amount.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. We'll finish up there.